Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Matt Russell. He's the president and CEO of Arbor Custom Analytics. How are you doing, Matt?
Great, Kevin. How are you?
Good. Doing very well. I probably caught you off guard. I put the doctor in front of your name because most of the stuff I've seen is just Matt. And as I kind of looked at your background more, I'm like, hey, this dude's got a PhD. It's like, oh, he's been doing a lot of analytics and taught and bounced around from different universities. And I believe you're back in Maine now. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, back here in well, some people call it vacation land, but yeah, the state of Maine is a great place to be.
Absolutely. So maybe to kick things off, maybe share with us your journey in forestry, because I know you did forestry in undergrad, and I believe you went to Virginia Tech for that master's, PhD at UMaine, even U Minnesota for a stint teaching and research. But maybe walk us through that journey of how you started in forestry, what got you going, and then that journey through academia, because obviously I don't believe you're in academia now. You're running Arbor Custom Analytics. So maybe give our audience a sense of your background and how you came to be where you are today.
Yeah, I think my experiences I don't think is very unlike what how many of us get into forestry. Always loved the outdoors. I grew up in upstate New York, where hiking and hunting in the Hudson Valley was my thing, and I met a few foresters. I actually worked for a logger when I was in high school and early part of college, and got to learn about why we're harvesting trees and what's the value of trees and all of that. And as a part of that, was asking around, some of the foresters we worked with, and I was like, well, where do you go to school for this? And they said, well, you can go to two places. If you want to stay in New York, you can go to SUNY ESF, which is in Syracuse, or you can go to a little school, Paul Smith's College, which is in the middle of the Adirondacks. And there's not much around other than, acres and acres of woods. And so I was like, I'm sold, going to the Adirondacks. And that was really where I started my forestry journey, and a number of years there, and then couldn't get it out of my skin. So yeah, as you mentioned, went to Virginia Tech for my master's, up here to University of Maine for my PhD, and out to Minnesota for a number of years after that.
Wow. And was there a thread that unified grad school in terms of areas of research, or was it a journey of discovery and figuring out what aspects of forest management, ecology, quantitative? I'm assuming there's an element of quantitative there, but was there a unifying thread across the different degrees?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's always been about the numbers behind forestry, forest measurements, forest analytics. And I actually, I never was really into math much, as a, high school and, in my college years. But one of the work study jobs I had when I was an undergrad was to do some tutoring. And so one of the students, I got assigned to tutor someone in forest measurements. And so I was like, oh, that's really cool. Because usually you get stuck with the tutoring jobs for like, the biology 101 or chemistry 101. And it's like, well, those are, certainly important science fields, but not ones that I was really intrigued about. So I thought, oh, awesome. I get to tutor about forest measurements. And so, I got to break open the Avery and Burkhart book and started going through that and just realized how much I love the measurement side of forestry. And so I didn't really know who to reach out to, in terms of, where to study for your grad program. Only, the person whose book I read, that was Dr. Harold Burkhart, who was down at Virginia Tech. And so, yeah, not really knowing anything about how to apply for grad school or get into grad school, went down during my spring break to Blacksburg that last year of my undergrad, and talked to Dr. Burkhart and said, I'm really interested in this. And he said, oh, that's great. We found a match. And little did I know, like most people did all that like months ago, when they were, applying to grad school. And so I kind of went about it more of an informal way. But yeah, that side of, connecting the trees and numbers together has always been what I value in terms of forestry.
Yeah. I was gonna say, you mentioned spring break. I was thinking last time I checked, Blacksburg didn't have a Daytona Beach. So the fact that you're doing that visit on spring break, it probably just speaks to you as a person curious and maybe not charting the same path as the institutions often say. So often very cool, like well-known name, Dr. Burkhart's work, and then Maine kind of presented itself. Was that a natural progression of, hey, I finished my master's at Virginia Tech, and then now I'm gonna go straight to the PhD. Was that always the game plan?
Yeah, well, actually, first, as I was finishing up my master's degree, there was an advertisement for a forest data management position with the Cooperative Forestry Research Unit, which is a really well-known, has been around for a long time, an industry and university research cooperative that does a lot of great research and work in the area of forestry. And what they've done is they basically were around for 30, 40 years and they had no one to really take a sense of, what's all the data that we have. We know that, like many projects done in academia, kind of faculty do them and then the data just sit with the faculty member. That faculty member retires and who knows where the data goes after that. And so that was a really cool, it was a short-term job for a year or 16 months. And, I got to work with a lot of data sets. And as I was doing that, my advisor at Maine was just getting up and going. And he basically said, well, you're working with all this data. Why don't you put it to some use and, use some of it as a part of a PhD program? And so I thought, the stars really aligned there. And so it just made a lot of sense to kind of transition from that job to the PhD program. And so everything worked out really well.
Yeah, very cool. And then you ended up at U Minnesota for quite a few years, right? I think like 8 or so years, so quite a long time. Was that tied to a research project, or is that more stepping stone? Like, were you thinking of going full blown academia? I'm partially dying to know this answer because I always joke, some of us go to the dark side. We don't go into the ivory towers. But what was the U Minnesota stint there, and what was that moment where you said, you know what, I'm going to come and launch Arbor Custom Analytics?
Yeah. What brought me to Minnesota was really a postdoc working with the U.S. Forest Service, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Group. As a part of my PhD, I did a little bit of work looking at understanding and modeling deadwood dynamics to get a sense of, we've got thousands of equations and we know so much about live trees, but what happens when they die? And certainly from a carbon perspective, we have a lot of unknowns. And so my postdoc there was really focused on that and had a great job, a great deal of work working on that project. And then not long after that, there was a faculty position that opened at University of Minnesota, and I was fortunate to get that. And for that work, I really focused on forest ecosystem health. So I kind of brought in, the quantitative side of forestry and how can we use modeling and different visualizations to understand what's going on in our forests, as we think about climate change, as we think about insects and diseases that are disturbing our forests on a regular basis. How can we use data and analytics to really understand that? So yeah, I was in a faculty position for about 8 years, and before I kind of ventured into my own private consulting work. And so yeah, haven't looked back ever since.
Yeah, awesome. Congrats. And so one of the things I know a lot of people in the audience will say, well, recently you've been talking to a lot of people with PhDs. Is that a requirement to be on the podcast? I'm like, no, it just seems to be the luck of the draws. I'm reaching out and talking to interesting people. Many of you seem to have that advanced graduate studies, and this is going to be a treat to have our conversation, because looking at the Arbor Custom Analytics website, there's blogs. You do a lot of writing to share your thoughts. You even have your own podcast. So kudos to you as two people running podcasts. They're fun to do. They take time, but they're a great way to give back to the community. So shout outs to you for doing that, and encourage a lot of people to just Google Arbor Custom Analytics. You'll find some of that stuff. But in that research of who you are and what you do, one of the conclusions I drew is there's a really broad breadth of topics that you cover, and we'll see that in the conversation, because I'm going to poke you in the blockchain world of things. But to start off with, what's the core business of Arbor Custom Analytics for our audience? If they were to give Matt a call and say, hey, I need help, what are those areas that you specialize in and offer services that would be a benefit to the community and industry?
Yeah, so the work that I do is really in support of forestry companies and organizations with data and analytics needs. And the word custom, I think, is really something that I value, because it seems like every project or everything that we do in forestry, we can't just use some software that's out there and plug in your numbers, plug in your data, and then just press go. It's a lot more customizable work. And so that's a word I really value in the kind of work that I do. And so most of what keeps me busy, obviously forest carbon is a big thing on topic within forestry companies and organizations nowadays. As new forest carbon markets are emerging, as landowners look to enroll their lands or think about the pros and cons of enrolling their lands, wanting to, potentially purchase timberlands for carbon markets and some of the other attributes, not just the timber, which obviously has been historically, what many in forestry have really valued in forests. And so forest carbon assessment, more broadly, forest resource assessments in general. Here, I sit in the US, we have a great national forest inventory with the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. And so you do a lot of work, using those data sets in support of, trying to get a sense of, well, we're thinking about planting a mill, or we're thinking about wanting to get a sense of, what's our woodshed look like relative to what we're using as a species. And so we've got a great data set as a part of our national forest inventory that can really answer those questions. And so that's really some data I work a lot with. And obviously, people are concerned with wanting to know what the forest will look like in the future. And so we do a lot of growth and yield modeling, statistical analyses, creating new equations to help refine some estimates of tree volume, biomass, and things like that in support for work that companies need.
Very cool, very cool, and lots of topics in there. We'll be able to deep dive and go into our conversation together. So maybe a broad question I'll start off with is around the force, like the carbon market side of things. What are we doing right, and what are we maybe not doing quite as well as we could do from your seat? Because again, you're a numbers guy, right? You're looking at the data. The data can't lie. There's folks taking different approaches to monitoring, the verification. It's quite, as the layperson, nebulous in terms of once you start going down this hole of carbon, it can go in so many different ways. But what do you think's working, and where do you see rooms for improvement from your seat as you look at the data itself?
Yeah, I think in terms of what's working, one of the things that I think really in recent years has come to be is that there's just a lot more opportunities for landowners to enroll and to think about carbon and to really, play a role in the climate change future of, of our country, of our globe. And so I think really the democratization, you might say, of some of these forest carbon markets is a good thing. Just providing accessibility and providing those markets to people that otherwise, wouldn't be able to enroll. In the US, we have the California Air Resources Board helps to, they have a great program that, enrolls lands and projects, but historically it's been really only the large landowners. And so there's no reason why someone with, 60 acres that they have their home on couldn't enroll their lands. And so that's what I think we're really doing right, is we're opening it up to a lot more people. I think in terms of areas of improvement, it's certainly the data, some of the equations that we use for understanding biomass and carbon haven't really changed in the last 20 years. And so when you think about, some of the estimates that we're providing, they're the same estimates we were providing 20 years ago, on maybe they were differently sized forests, but I think there's still a lot of opportunities to really refine some of the estimates we have with our carbon equations, things that we use to develop and to estimate, and certainly with uncertainty, how much carbon is out there and how much might be contributing to a project as a part of that. And so I think there's always concern about not just the amount of carbon credits, but the quality of them, and so I think that's something that's really gotten a lot of critique in recent years, is understanding, okay, where are those carbon credits coming from? And if you're planting trees, where are you planting the trees? Or if you're doing an improved forest management project, what's really changing? What's the additionality? So I think that's great, this increased eye toward each project in terms of what's happening and what's good and what's not. I think there's always going to be concern over the quality. And I think some of the improvements might be to just continue to look at the quality of carbon credits and not just the amount of them.
For sure, for sure. And thinking of that, Matt, like in your business, would you say it's split 50-50 in terms of carbon related business and growth and yield, or other? Is it that dominating in terms of the surge in interest in carbon? Or do you still see it kind of as a small, not quite niche, but maybe not very few applying it, or maybe giving you a call up? What can you share on that front? Do you really see a surge on that front?
Yeah, I think 50-50 is a pretty good approximation. I think too, And a lot of people will talk about kind of carbon, in the broader spectrum of, ESG and what that means for a company, or the environmental, social, and governance structure of, an organization. And so I think a lot of companies are too thinking about, where does ESG fit in their portfolio, and how can, if we own forest land, can't we just grow our forests and offset all the emissions that our company makes? And so there's a lot of good work to be made in that area. And that I think is going to be increasing in more years. But yeah, I mean, I think there's still, if you think about the forest carbon stuff, maybe it wasn't here as much 10 years ago, as widespread in the forestry community. It's certainly a popular thing that people want answers on today. But there are still, I work with a lot of people that still want basic questions answered, like, what's the volume going to be in our forest in 20 years? And for that, we need good data, to input, into forest growth and yield models. We need to have a good sense about, how confident are we in those results, and, if we want to, do more inventories, how can we do that, effectively and efficiently with the resources that they have. And so that I kind of see as the core forestry work that I don't really think is going anywhere. We're still going to need good data on our forests because we rely on those data for some of these newer things like forest carbon assessments, like ESG portfolio protocols and things like that. So I think all of it really relies on just the quality of data that a company is working with.
Yeah, for sure. And so as someone who's written over 80 peer-reviewed articles and even two books, you obviously know maybe just a wee little bit about this topic of equations and those being used. And as you know, a lot of remote sensing projects, especially on the inventory side now, whether spaceborne or airborne lidar, or you name it, whatever flavor, there's always boots on the grounds. And as you pointed out, there's some equation that is being used to flip what's being measured into something, and then at the plot level, and then putting it to the pixel, or maybe at the tree, and going to the stand or the track level, whatever jargon, depending what jurisdiction you are. Are we doing it wrong? Do you, like, to come back to your comment around the equations, where a lot of people are still using the same ones? I remember using ones that were like 50 years old, none the wiser as whether they worked or not, as opposed to, hey, the coefficient of determination looks pretty good, it's 0.82, so it must be awesome. But beyond that, no real thought into where that equation came from. Do you sense that we're at a inflection point where we need to ask those questions around the source of those equations, the vintage, the pedigree, if that's the right word, of these equations? What are you seeing based on your work? Can we increase the precision of some of these inventories by looking at what source equations we're using? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. There's definitely, if you dig in, you read a report on, a forest carbon project, and they're doing something. If you really dig down deep, yeah, you'll find what those equations are that they're using. But honestly, now it's like, it doesn't matter so much, the equations that we're using, but it matters how we bring all the data together to talk to one another. And just like you said, with enhanced forest inventories, where, the plots on the ground are a major component of what we might do, but it's, how can we get some, whether it's LiDAR or imagery from Landsat, if we're looking to go backwards in time or something, how can we kind of get those data to talk to one another? And from a modeling perspective, increasing a lot of the models that we do, some people don't even really call it statistics, because we're doing more of what some people will call the black box models, things like random forests or other machine learning technologies that are non-parametric in their design. So you don't necessarily know what the parameters are that you're dealing with in many of those models. So um, it's funny. I remember being at a conference when I was a grad student, forest mensurationist conference, and this was pretty early on when people were just starting to use random forests as a tool to understand, and really to bring it into the forestry profession. But there must have been like 4 or 5 talks, mostly by grad students, talking about how they use random forests, and they did this and came up with this result. And then finally, someone toward the end of the conference raised their hand and said, "What's random forest anyway?" um, and so fast forward now, maybe 10 years later, and it's just it's so widespread and used very often, just because I kind of use that technique, kind of this more machine learning based algorithm, just to get a sense of what I should be looking at. I'm still, I still like to fit equations, like that's kind of the core of me, but I'll often use a tool like random forest to get a sense about, okay, which variables should I be looking at first that might be predicting something that I'm interested in, whether that be biomass or volume or carbon, or something. So yeah, I think um, the ability to kind of use those different techniques, not just, your traditional linear regression, on data measured through time, those are really going to be the key things in the future, is just getting all these data to talk to one another using some of these more advanced techniques.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it's ironic that when folks in forestry hear random forest, they naturally conclude that a forester came up with this, and in reality, I think it's from the medical field that the random forest, the forests are actually a function of the methodology versus anything to do with actual trees. But that's a good segue to my next question, because as someone who's obviously statistically trained, understands the science of statistics intimately well as some of the machine learning techniques. You kind of brought up the black box, and that's something we often hear from foresters saying, like, I don't care about this machine learning thing. It's a black box. Like, I need to be able to explain what is happening in this growth and yield model or something else. I like how you said, you're using the machine learning to help maybe guide you in looking at which variables you might use in some of your parametric modeling. But I also know there's a lot of people who do parametric modeling first and then use the machine learning then as the final model, because they can provide that explanation to maybe those people who are looking for more guts versus saying, hey, it's a black box. I couldn't tell you beyond, goes in and spits something out and it's accurate. It's good. But where do you see in your seat right now? Is it really a question around one is better than the other? Because some might argue the machine learning is better than the parametric approaches. It removes some of the needs for some of the assumptions associated with parametric modeling, whether it's from just sampling to building the models themselves. But do you see the world in forestry with some of that growth and yield work you're doing shifting away from the traditional and starting to embrace some of the new? Or do you think it's just a sector that, hey, we always need to explain the relationship with these variables, otherwise it'll just never jive with the forest industry? Where do you see the world going with AI and machine learning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's just a lot of opportunities with, AI and machine learning and all these new ways of understanding. But I'll tell you, in the forestry world, a lot of people, just don't really care how you get the answer, as long as as long as you get an answer that's pretty good to what the value should be or what they anticipate the value should be. And so that's not to say that, we shouldn't care about how we do our modeling, but just the reality is, okay, if you come up with a great way to, predict something happening or not predict it well, that's going to be really important to us as a company, or to be within plus or minus 10% of the true value is important. So I definitely think that there's that sentiment across, in our discipline, and you don't necessarily need to explain everything to people you're talking with. But that ability that you definitely need to, if you're the one developing those models, to justify the use of them and everything. And I think now, I mean, there's so many great ways to more easily do the machine learning, and the AI tools seem like they're becoming more and more abundant, and even like user interfaces, and there's a lot more ways to kind of go about it, rather than trying to, okay, here's my data set, let me fit the linear regression and see what comes out on the other end. So yeah, I mean, any student that's in forestry today that especially wants to get in the quantitative side, definitely be taking those classes, the random forest, non-parametric statistics. Those are just going to be incredibly valuable into the future.
For sure, for sure. And thinking of that as this being the Digital Forester podcast, everyone's interested in tools. So what's the toolkit that Dr. Matt Russell uses? Are you a open sourcey guy? Are you a closed source commercial? Don't really care, or where do you stand on that? The first question. And then based on that, what's the toolkit you use to do all your ninja voodoo magic statistical AI work?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely a big proponent of open source. I'm pretty much, R is open every day on my computer. That's kind of my go-to for doing all my analytical work. I've increasingly been trying to push a lot more of that to GitHub. GitHub being a shared repositories, to share code and to, be able to work on others' programs and code sets, and update things. And that seems to have been taking the world of computer programming, by storm really the last 10 years. And I think it's just starting to creep into to the forestry world. I think a lot of folks are doing that. So yeah, not to say I don't use the proprietary software. I do use those when I have to. I still have some SAS script I run now and then to, that's where I first learned statistics on, was using SAS. And I think there's a lot of value in not going all in on one, tool, but to have at your disposal lots of different ones to choose from, and all that. But for me, R is my go-to for all my analytics.
Very cool, very cool. And thinking of that, just more curiosity from this guy. It's like you mentioned early on, getting into the quantitative side. So where was it hard for you to learn scripting, or is that something that just came naturally as a data and numbers guy? The syntax of the scripting language just spoke to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I really caught on to programming and coding once I attached it to data. And that is to say, like, I do remember, like, one of my undergrad classes, we had to do some coding, and it wasn't really like we were doing these for loops and do loops, and it wasn't really like sure what, like, data, like, how are we applying this in life. But for me, learning statistics and doing coding, like, once I realized, like, okay, here's a, forest inventory, went out and collected 10 plots, and we're going to go summarize that data in the field. That's where it really clicked for me. So otherwise, programming just wasn't much interest of me. And until I connected it really to the forest, then it really kind of all made sense. And I could tie that to understanding, okay, yeah, if we want to do a simulation of this forest inventory to come up with, I don't know, a bootstrapped estimate uh, of tree volume per acre or something, well, you need to do some coding and some programming for that. So that's what made it click for me.
Very cool, very cool. So I'm going to take you down a path, and I'm pretty pumped to do this because I think you're one of the guys I can do this on the podcast. Not to say other previous guests could not, but again, just given your quantitative background and some of the things I've read, or you've written that I've read, it sounds like given the work you've done, the books you've published, there's some tests and or exercises, I should say, maybe not tests, but exercises that one can go through and see how they rank and whether they learn the topics well. And I believe recently you asked, like, it's in the news, ChatGPT. You asked ChatGPT to see if it could pass your exercises. And I believe you reported that ChatGPT, I won't say failed, maybe like, below 50%, but it doesn't sound like it also knocked it out of its park. So I'm curious to know first if you could introduce for our audience what ChatGPT is, and then two, it's like, what was the experiment you did to see if the large language learning model, the LLM that is known as ChatGPT, what it did with your forest measurement exercises?
Yeah, so ChatGPT, yeah, if you haven't heard in the news, it's developed by OpenAI, a company that's really doing artificial intelligence, really at the cutting edge. And it's basically a chat bot, a really, really smart chat bot. And so you type in, whatever you want answered, and it spits back to you, using artificial intelligence, scraping the web, a detailed response. And so I know a lot of people are concerned, especially teachers, that, well, eighth graders can just go in, type in their homework assignment, and then it gives the answer, write a 500-word essay about, I don't know, someone, and then it spits out the answer. And so a lot of people are concerned about that. And there's been, rules and people outlawing it and some people embracing it. But so what I did was I didn't realize up until a little while ago that you can actually, it does programming for you. And so you can basically tell it to write me a script that calculates the area of a circle, and then replicates that 5,000 times, and spit me out the mean value of the areas of different size circles. And so we can write that really in a lot of different programming languages. And so I recently published a book last year called Statistics and Natural Resources Applications in R. And it's a pretty introductory statistics textbook, mostly for undergraduate and graduate students as well, that really focuses on, it has some data sets on natural resources, forestry, wildlife data sets. And kind of as you work through the textbook, there are exercises at the end of each section. And so what I was curious was, like, I really wanted to know, like, how can ChatGPT answer these questions? And sure enough, like, I basically put them in just almost word for word. And I'll put in, hey ChatGPT, write me R script that calculates the mean value from this data set found in this package, and it does it. There are some weird things that it provided, like some of the things like units that it provided for some of the values, like wasn't sure what they were getting them from the web, but it wasn't the same as what was in the data set that was being used. And so there's definitely some weird things that it did. But on the whole, like it probably would have passed, if I gave a if I gave a test, with those exercises in the book. And I know that other folks have found, I think I can't remember, but they asked ChatGPT to take the SATs and scored like a 1280, I think, which would get you into a lot of good colleges and universities. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that should be on the mind of, first of all of us in society. I think the the ways that that can influence all of the work that we do, both personally and professionally, is going to have a major impact. But also, especially those in programming, like just be aware of that. There's a tool like that that exists that you can, send code to, or find other ways to write your code or to debug your code. I think it could be potentially a useful tool into the future.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely you can have a lot of fun with Chat GPT, asking it really mundane, dumb questions and get fascinating responses back. But you're absolutely right. And I know a lot of folks who listen to this podcast often will say, like, oh, here we go. It's like, are we trying to get rid of boots on the ground again, right? Diminish the forester's role or job. And always, I think from the get-go with these technologies, it's never about getting rid of boots on the ground, but maybe tweaking how those boots are used on the ground. But this is one that's quite interesting, because if you can ask it a question or prompt it to come up with a set of instructions, could you go so far as to say, hey, I've got this robot, can you measure every single tree that's greater than 9 centimeters dbh and measure the height as well, and just let this thing rip? I don't know, I'd be curious to see what happens. So I thought that was pretty funny when you ran the test. I'm like, hey, it didn't get 100%. And then what it found, maybe there's some merit in it, who knows. So super cool. So definitely encourage our audience to, one, take a look at the book you've written, especially if people are using R and comfortable with R, or any data scientists. Check that book out, but also check out Chat GPT. So the other topic I wanted to pick your brain. I know a lot of people say, stop saying pick your brain, it doesn't sound right, but I literally want to pick your brain on this front. But DAOs, or for those who don't know what the term is, decentralized autonomous organizations. I haven't gone on the crypto spiel spout in quite a few podcasts, mostly because, given current markets, with anything from FTX to Celsius to Voyager, if you are truly into crypto, maybe you're dealing with some pain. So we just avoid that. But this is one that's interesting in the sense of moving away from crypto, but the blockchain itself, and how blockchains can be used for other use cases other than purely crypto. And you publish a blog, and I hadn't seen it before, and I thought this is so cool, about a DAO that bought land in the US, by raising or selling non-fungible tokens to people that were living around the world. But these folks, these 6,000 or so NFT holders, now own physical land. I can't remember if it's Wyoming or somewhere, but maybe for our listeners, what are your thoughts on blockchains, and what do they mean for forestry? And given this example of people around the world buying NFTs for physical forest land, does that excite you? Does that scare the bejesus out of you? Or do you think that's just a natural progression of where this world's going?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing this up. But I do think it's something that anyone that deals with land management or land ownership needs to have in mind. That is these decentralized autonomous organizations. I think, and I am no expert. Don't cite me about your ideas for crypto, but I'm kind of, it feels like I'm on the sidelines just eating the popcorn, watching everything that's going down with crypto. But I think if you hear and you listen to a lot of the big people in finance, certainly there's a lot of big people that CEOs of major banks that don't want anything to do with crypto and the currency aspects of it. But they won't say that about the blockchain technology. They'll say the blockchain technology is absolutely perfect. Like we were, a lot of major banks are starting to run on some of those technologies. And so, yeah, what really intrigued me actually first was I read this book called The Metaverse. This was by Matthew Ball, and it was really eye-opening to me. And I don't know much about virtual reality and all of that, but he has a short section in there where he describes, these decentralized autonomous organizations and this land in Wyoming that a group basically got together and purchased 40 acres of land using this blockchain technology through the sale, as you mentioned, Kevin, of these non-fungible tokens. And I thought, man, that's really interesting because, you know, one of the things that we know in forestry, not necessarily for the big, you know, the corporate landowners or the public landowners, but really for the smaller, you know, we call them non-industrial private landowners. We know that lots of those lands are, you know, there's not just one owner and one decision maker on those forest lands. There's many, you know, uptime, you know, dozens at some point. And so one of the big things about the DAOs that's ongoing is that, you know, this idea of the collective decision making can happen based on being a part of this blockchain technology. And I thought, well, that's really cool. And there's a lot of parallels to what we do in forestry, you know, in terms of, you know, certainly for the smaller private landowners where, you know, there's multiple families that maybe have a stake, or multiple people within those families have a stake in the land. And that ought to, as I got kind of digging into it more, that really ought to be something that we should at least think about in the forestry space, particularly when you think about carbon markets. And when you think about, you know, the decentralization that's going on there a little bit in terms of trying to open up and provide carbon market opportunities to all landowners, I think this idea of looking to DAOs and this blockchain technology ought to be something that we look into as foresters.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%, 100%. Totally agree with you. It's a fascinating future as you start commingling these different technologies from other spaces and seeing how they could stick. Now, as we look forward, and it's a fascinating conversation, we can go all over the place. Another theme that you've talked about, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on, because it's one that I remember speaking about several years ago, and I'm pretty sure I got laughed out of the room, which is normally the norm for this guy. I speak these things and people are like, yeah, whatever, not a chance, haha, get out of here. And yet through time, not to say I'm right all the time, but through time, some of these ideas come back. And one of those terms that I came across was the citizen data scientist. We hear about democratization of this and that. We talk about volunteer geographic information, VGI, if you're coming from the GIS space. But this citizen data scientist, what does that mean to you, and what's the power behind this concept as it relates to data science and forestry?
Yeah, that's another interesting one. I think, you know, when you look at the history of, like, you know, how forestry organizations are structured, oftentimes it's like all the analytical people in one department, or, you know, all the numbers people in one department, and, you know, the land management people in another, and certainly the, you know, more corporate positions, you know, in another. And so it's always kind of been distributed like that. But I think the idea of citizen data science, you know, is just the opportunity to incorporate more viewpoints into the, the delivery and the development of a data product. And so with that, you know, you can imagine, you know, I think what it means for us as foresters is it's not just the analytical people building their tools and then giving it to the land managers, but the land managers actually have a say in how those tools are developed, what kind of products, you know, how does it look, how does it feel, what kind of data might feed it. I think that's another way that really opens up and really provides access to everyone in the organization to have a stake in what the product is. And I think that's really important because, you know, oftentimes, you know, and perhaps you've been a part of these projects too, Kevin, it's like, well, you develop something that's a really, really good tool that the analytical team thinks is perfect, and then you go out and it's just not adopted, you know, out there by your land managers or your foresters, because the foresters say, oh, well, you should have really done this, you know, from the start. And then, you know, it would have been a perfect tool. We would have used it right away. And so I think that idea of, you know, having, you know, so-called citizens being a part of the data science process is just a great one, because you don't want to develop a tool that's not going to be used. And the earlier feedback you get into the development of a product is just going to make that product better in the long run.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Now, obviously, you've developed a lot of tools. Is there an experience more closer to heart where you can say, you know, I put all my best intentions, my passion, like tons of effort into this tool, and then it didn't quite reach that adoption, and only for you to find out, yeah, you didn't add an extra button, or they really wanted okay instead of next. Any fun stories from your experiences in that space?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it, maybe not necessarily with the tools, but I think a lot of like the writing that I do, like I love to write, and I try to write pretty regularly, but a lot of the writing I do, like I'll have an idea for something. I think, yeah, a lot of people are going to like this, are going to catch on. I think this has a lot of potential. Whereas other things, it's like, I'm going to write this on a Friday afternoon, and it's going to be, going to go out there and like, I don't care if anyone really reads it, but then a lot of people latch onto it and really read it. So yeah, it's always surprising. I guess nothing specific comes to mind, but it's always surprising what does catch on and what doesn't.
Sure.
And really, I mean, I think you can think about everything, every product or tool that's developed there's a distribution to it where you either have wide adoption or no adoption. And some of that you can anticipate and some of it you can't. So I think it's all about kind of how you sell the product, how you market the product, and all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots goes into that, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I love that in the sense as a content creator, if we use that term, you are doing that with all the different channels that you're sharing information, and truthfully, some of the topics we talked about comes from that treasure chest of different themes. And the last theme I want to maybe kind of get your thoughts on in the time that we have left together is one that I've heard repeatedly as I've talked with different people, and it has to do with the workforce, whether the workforce is aging and people don't want to be forcers. Maybe there's not enough investment into, maybe grassroots isn't the right word, but that younger, get them early, I guess, in the educational system and train them. I know I hear stories from different groups where their starting point was maybe a ranger camp or some type of experience, and those programs are largely have already dried up, or the last few that are around are kind of going the way of the dinosaur. But one of the things that you talked about in some of your writing is literally, I'll just look at my notes, it's the H2B workers, and I assume not, I'm up in Canada here, so I'm sure we don't have the equivalent, but I assume it's a work visa. But I think that in your writings, the part that I took away that was really interesting was that you wrote that 2% of advertised forestry jobs were filled by American workers, and only 2%. So I'm curious to know, and see if I can pull different threads together from other people I've talked to. This is a real issue, from basic forestry field work to truck drivers. I know you've written in research about wages and whatnot, but to what extent is this a real issue in the forestry industry? Is this something we need to pay attention to now, or we should have paid attention to it 10 years ago, 20 years ago? But where do things sit from your seat based on your research and outlook?
Yeah, I think the workforce is a big issue that I think we're faced with. And increasingly, like when I talk to companies, it's not, certainly they have challenges with, their operations or with their data, and that's what I help out with. But the thing that they most say is their biggest problem is the people. They can't recruit people, especially in rural areas, to work at mills or to drive trucks to deliver wood to those mills. They can't recruit, even forest scientists. We have data in the US that says our forest research capacity in terms of the number of scientists has declined by 12% over the last 10 years or so. And so that's a big concern as well. But yeah, I mean, there's just an incredible amount, from all levels, from people planting trees to people, doing the science on those tree plantings. And yeah, I see that as really a big issue that I think the forestry community is going to have to, reckon with here in the near future. The work on the H-1B visas, is just an important one. We're increasingly finding, fewer and fewer, teenagers want to go out and plant trees for a summer. And so what the United States does is they rely on this guest worker program, not immigrants, they're just guest workers for a short period of time to do things like the tree planting and the vegetation management and things like that. And there's been a lot of organizations that have been advocating for more of that, those guest workers to be done, because we just need it. When you think about all of the initiatives like the Trillion Tree Initiative, like some of these widespread efforts to plant more trees, it's like, well, who's going to be doing all those tree planting efforts? It's certainly not going to be the high schooler, in their summer vacation. And so, we need to be realistic about, who's actually going to be doing all this work. And same thing with the truck drivers, and I know some companies have made good progress on this, but for us, it's like, well, we know that if a forest isn't managed, like, it's not going to be valued at all. And, we can't support the economy and especially in many rural areas without, good management. And with that is truck drivers, they're a big part of that process. And so, yeah, I've done a little bit of work kind of trying to get a sense of, okay, what for those in the logging industry, what does that look like and what are the trends there? But I think that's another big thing, when you have someone with the same set of skills, why do you want to drive a truck, in the woods and go back 10 miles to get the wood and bring it out to a small little town versus you could be driving for a big box store and, be on the interstate and do a comfortable drive all day. That's hard to compete with for us in the forestry industry. So yeah, there's a lot of interest in ways to try to recruit drivers and tree planters to the forestry industry. So a big thing that I think we're going to be reckoning with here in the future.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. I normally joke with everyone in forestry, nothing's easy. Everything is like this complex issue, multifaceted, and for some of us, that's why we love being in this space. So the last question or set of questions I have before we look to wind down is because this is the Digital Forester podcast, we always ask the folks on the show uh, about technology trends, and generally we frame them as kind of a 1 year, 3 year, and then 10 year time frame. So maybe in the near term, short term, what type of technologies gets you as a data scientist or a forest analytics person, or whatever choice word we want to use? What gets Matt excited? And if we go so far as to look out 10 years out, which I know is like, eons in the technology space, but is there something that you're kind of gravitating to or keeping your eye on because it really excites you? What are your thoughts on those two questions?
Yeah, well, I think we talked about many of them here today. The first, next year or so, I'm definitely encouraged to see kind of where the forest carbon market plays out. And I think the successful groups there are going to be the ones that are really relying heavily on the technology to assess, forest projects and, get a sense of what kind of forest carbon is there and enrolling them in markets. And so that I think is going to be interesting to see just kind of, there's a lot of players in there now and, will one rise to the top where they all kind of have an equitable distribution of all the work. And so that I think is going to be interesting. And two, I think that Chat GPT and kind of text analytics work is really in the next year going to be really insightful, and I think going to be really impactful in terms of how we do our everyday work. And so when you look a year or a couple of years out, that really is what really gets me excited. I think kind of longer term, and not necessarily relying on any tools, but I think, it seems like we're increasingly shortening the time between when we collect the data and when we analyze and make decisions with the data. And I think that window in the near future, the longer term future, is just going to get narrower and narrower. And so, someone can be out in the field and measuring the data, goes back immediately. You can get an estimate of, carbon or volume, on the spot. And, there's no reason. I mean, some companies are doing that now in many ways, but I think that it always seems like, we're always planning, because our trees grow slowly, we're always planning out in advance. Here's what we're going to inventory next year. And it's like, well, if we can inventory it now, can't we get the decision that we need right now if we're out on the ground, where there's boots on the ground or technology and sensors to help us with those measurements. So I think kind of longer term, that's going to be really, really exciting to follow, just kind of that narrower window between data collection and time to make decisions.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. So I know I keep saying it's my last question, and I keep lying by asking more and more questions, but this one will be the final question. I promise, because I'm curious to know what your answer is. So, what would you? So let's say where are we? Yeah. So spring break is coming up. Now, a young Matt is now making the trip to wherever you are in Maine with similar questions as you once had when you went to see Dr. Burkhardt at Virginia Tech. Um, what would be the piece of advice that you would give that young Matt that would come visit you today, now that you've gone through this incredible journey in terms of graduate school and now doing consulting work on the side and helping what sounds like a broad, diverse set of clients? But is there a tidbit of advice you would give that young forester that's coming up the ranks?
Yeah, I think it's really to value, it's going to be a non-technology answer to a question, but it's going to be really to value the people that you work with. I think that matters a whole lot. I once heard someone say that, I wrote it down just so I remembered it, but he said that any analytical product doesn't move at the speed of science, but it moves at the level of trust. And I think there's a lot of meaning in that because, if you're developing tools and you don't have good relationships with the people that are using those tools, that are going to implement those tools, or the decision makers that use the products from those tools, I think that matters quite a bit. And you don't want to be the person that just is toiling away on their computer all day and making things without having those relationships to people. And so that matters so much. We're a small community in forestry, and so people know people, and your ability to network and to get a sense about people from all levels of your organization, what they do, what their roles are, is just that much more important. And it can really help you in your everyday work and in terms of analytics. So I think that's really important. If I were to tell my younger person, my younger self going on spring break, anything, that might be it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, trust and the human factor always comes back to people. So hey, as we wind down, I love the conversation. I know I took you in left field, right field, center field, and probably back to the change room and then out to the parking lot and tried to pull you back into the field there. But definitely appreciate you sharing your thoughts. So as someone who's very active on social, and I encourage our audience, if you're curious, there's newsletters, there's blogs, but even LinkedIn newsletters that will drop right into your inbox or on your feeds there. Lots of different ways to interact with Dr. Matt Russell here. But what's the best way if someone's listening going like, hey, there's something I heard, or just interested in getting Arbor Custom Analytics to do some custom work in the spirit of building, starting that trust relationship. What's the best way for people to reach out to you? Is there a certain channel that you'd prefer, website, social, or email? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is best for me. I check that pretty much every day and try to post what I'm up to there. I like to say that I work in public, and so obviously not with every project that I work on, but as I like to share things with the community, I post it all there. And I've got a LinkedIn newsletter, as you mentioned, Kevin, that try to provide timely things and things of relevance to get people thinking about forestry and data, and to get people to uh, provide some education piece along with that. So yeah, LinkedIn is best. And my website is arbor-analytics.com if you want to read some of my blog posts, or put some presentations and other things up there if you're interested in that.
There you go. There you go, folks. So if you want to reach out to Dr. Matt Russell from Arbor Custom Analytics, LinkedIn is the easy way, as well as his website. So Matt, appreciate the time you carving out to speak with this guy. Totally love the conversation. Love seeing where the world could go. And as I said, I took you left, right, center. So thanks for playing along or agreeing to play along in this ping pong game of conversations. But I found it fascinating. In all honesty, I read your stuff that you post. I really do enjoy seeing a different lens to what's happening out there in the world. So thanks so much for joining me today, and look forward to speaking with you again.
Sounds good. And big thanks to you, Kevin, for this podcast. And you really do a lot for the community of us digital foresters. And yeah, awesome work by you. And thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Good stuff. We'll talk soon.